Final Fantasy is one of my favorite series of all time. This series is where I learned the magic of RPGs. When a friend of mine told me that she had never played a Final Fantasy game, I knew what I wanted to do next. Now, I want to make this very, very clear. Ranking these does not mean that I think any of these games are bad. In fact, making this video felt way more like a celebration of the franchise to me than an exercise to put some games down just to uplift others. So if you feel differently about the order, that's okay. And honestly, this isn't even just a ranking video. I'd call this a ranking with some mini retrospective elements. So we'll call this a Final Fantasy retrospective ranking celebration extravaganza. But I have to start with Final Fantasy XI. This is the only one that I have not actually played. I didn't have a way to plug an Ethernet into my PS2 back in the day, nor did we have a good PC or that internet dongle for the 360. In fact, the computer we had a hard time running MapleStory, if you know what that is. But I still want to highlight this game because I respect the heck out of it. I'm familiar enough with parts of the story from other games like Final Fantasy Record Keeper. Yes, I too once suffered from I Play Gadget Games-itis. And I think this is an important part of the Final Fantasy franchise history, as it paved the way for games like Final Fantasy XIV, which is on this list. And you could still play it via Steam. Wait, you could still play this on Steam? Well, that's the video, guys. See ya. But I don't want to officially rank this game because that would feel disingenuous. This game represented a new experiment for the developers, as it was announced at the Square Millennium event alongside 9 and 10, which obviously we'll get to later. After moving to Hawaii and being exposed to more Western games, including MMOs, Hironobu Sakaguchi, sweet Sakaguchi, saw an opportunity for the Final Fantasy franchise to fill the gap of high-quality Japanese MMOs. It was then designed and produced by Hiromichi Tanaka, who worked alongside Sakaguchi on many of the greats of the series, and carried the torch after Sakaguchi left. This game was based in the world of Vana'diel, I think that's how you say it. It included a number of different races and jobs to build your characters, including Humes, basically humans, Elvan, the elves, Tarutaro, basically adult children, Shantoto probably having the most representation in all of the spin-off series, Mithra, a humanoid cat race, and the Galka, this Hulk-like race. There's so much detail I could go into about this game, but the one standout to me that I really wanted to talk about is the design choice to make this game almost impossible to play solo. As the story goes, the developers looked at the existing library of Final Fantasy games, took note of the party-based system, and wanted to emphasize this to encourage players to participate in the global community in order to progress. This, of course, caused some to love this game and others to move along. But I really think this was a brilliant move at the time for an MMO. Overcoming this kind of difficulty by playing with others is a surefire way to forge bonds amongst players, and that's exactly what it did for people who played this game. But despite the excellent party-based system of this game being a major reason for the fanbase, I'm gonna have to agree with Channel Raznov from the comment section of one of my previous videos. My friend Channel Raznov here mentioned that they would love to see a morphed single-player version of Final Fantasy XI, since they've already introduced what are called trusts into the system that basically make the game a single-player experience as is. And I totally agree. I'd love to see them convert this game to a single-player experience altogether. If 11 is anything like 14, it's a story that should be experienced even after 20 plus years of running as an MMO. But Brandon, you handsome hero of light, I hear you say, this sounds like a fever dream. But hold your horses. Dragon Quest X Offline in Japan is doing exactly this, so it's not outside of the realm of possibility, even if it's unlikely. So now, without further ado, let's get to my actual ranking, and of course, let me know where you would rank 11 if you've played it. Starting with number 15, Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy I tells the epic tale of 4 heroes of light prophesied to save the world from a time of darkness in which the 4 crystals that govern the elements and therefore the state of the world are threatened by the 4 fiends who were sent by the true big baddie, Chaos. This is the classic tale that laid the foundation for the entire series because, you know, it was the first one. Final Fantasy I was created by Hironobu Sakaguchi after Square saw the success of Dragon Quest from its rival at the time, Enix. The rocky love story between Square and Enix is a topic for another video. Apparently, before the success of Dragon Quest, Square really wasn't hearing it from Sakaguchi about wanting to make an RPG because they thought for certain it was going to be a flop. As time progressed and the project showed more promise, Hiromichi Tanaka, another legend, and his B team decided to join the Final Fantasy train. They brought on many notable names, including Yoshitaka Amano for the designs, Nobuo Uematsu for the music, who honestly is like 50% of why I love these games, as well as Nasir Gabelli, who coded the entire game. Inspired by games like Ultima and Wizardry, this dream team would take from Dungeons & Dragons, craft a story based on Sakaguchi's input, create a class system with 6 classes as well as upgrades for some of those classes, and tie it all up with a banger soundtrack. The game initially released in 1987 in Japan and 1990 in North America to great success. So much success, in fact, that it not only kicked off the development of a sequel, but over the years has been re-released and remastered like 20 times. And this is how I ended up playing the game originally. Specifically in this case, Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls, which was a remaster that introduced 4 additional dungeons, a bestiary, and some additional changes. This was a classic Final Fantasy experience, and it was so much better than I expected, especially as the first in the series. Not to mention, playing it on the Game Boy Advance SP was mwah! I also bought the PSP 20th anniversary version, and this one GameStop did not take away from me, which included better graphics, more dungeons, super bosses added, the soundtrack from the Final Fantasy Origins version, which was the PlayStation 1 remaster, as well as more Amano artwork and new FMV cutscenes. And of course now there's the Pixel remaster. While this version doesn't include all the extra content from the Game Boy Advance or PSP version, it does have a better pixel design, redone music, and the ability to modify things like encounter rate, guild experience, etc. And seriously, do not skip on this music. Even to this day, some of these tracks are iconic. So that's probably the best version to check out, even though I personally prefer the PSP game. And as much as I love this game, it remains 15 on the list because it's still the most basic Final Fantasy game, but it's way better than you might expect. If you're looking for a classic RPG experience and you're willing to go back to the roots of the series, this is still a great game. Number 14, Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III.
Final Fantasy III.
Not that one. Introduced the job system to the Final Fantasy franchise. But we wouldn't know the significance of this in the West until it came out 16 years later as a remake on the Nintendo DS. This game kicks off with the Heroes of Light embarking on a journey, by which I mean falling down a hole and desperately trying to escape, where they come across the Wind Crystal, who gives them this new power so they can change into different jobs instead of their starting Onion Knight class. And of course, they're given the task of restoring the balance of the world. Of course, we will get back to that Onion Knight class eventually. During their journey, the crew come and fight alongside many named NPCs such as Princess Sarah, Desh, poor dude, and our classic Cid. Gotta have Cid, right? As they journey across this massive world, lose multiple airships, and defeat the baddies sent out by the main antagonist, Zand. Well, sort of the main antagonist. And eventually infiltrate the iconic Crystal Tower to confront Zand and force every single player of this game to consider whether or not it is actually worth beating this game after multiple deaths and having to start from scratch every time you're defeated. I'm not better. The design choices and jobs in this game would become the foundation of later games in the series, so despite its lower placement on my list, I have a great appreciation for this game. The original Final Fantasy III was developed by the same dream team that made up 1 and 2, and would be the last new Final Fantasy game that Nasir Gabelli would work on. And this one would go on to be the biggest game ever made on the Nintendo or Famicom in Japan, at a whopping 512 kilobytes on the cartridge, which at the time was the second biggest cartridge capacity for the console. And it makes sense if you've played this game. You start on what you think is the world map, and it turns out after you progress, it's this simple floating island hovering over this massive world map. For the time, I'm sure this would have been absolutely mind-blowing. But of course, it was never localized and brought to the States in its original form because the team got straight to building on Nintendo's newly released Super Famicom, or the SNES in the States. And they didn't have the manpower at the time to do that and localize Final Fantasy III into English. In addition to the new job system, this is the first in the series to include some iconic battle commands for different classes. It's a core part of the series by now, and that all started with Final Fantasy III. In 2006, this game finally came out to the States in the form of a Nintendo DS remake. This remake included added backstories and actual names for the main characters. In the original, they were just your generic warriors of light that you could name, now known as Luneth, Ark, Refia, and Ingus. But their backstories really didn't have much impact on the story. That and the enemies were harder, because why not make a hard game even harder to endear newcomers? And of course, the DS is where I came in for this one. Because, you know, it was the only option for me at the time. I had no idea how to emulate or what an English translation pack was. I got this one in high school, and I honestly didn't take it to the end initially. Not only was this game hard and confusing with the job system, specifically that some parts of the game essentially required certain types of jobs to be used to survive, and that's not always obvious. But 2006 through 2007 were also massive years for RPGs on the PS2, the DS, and the PSP, many of which I talk about in this video. And I was surprised to learn that I already knew some of the music for this game due to being introduced to albums like The Black Mages, Final Fantasy Prey, and Final Fantasy Love Will Grow. Seriously though, if you have never heard of The Black Mages and you're a Final Fantasy fan, do yourself a favor and look them up. It's a rock band led by Nobuo Uematsu. There's 3 albums, and it's all epic Final Fantasy music. I was that kid in high school who would listen to this on my CD player while others were enjoying tunes from groups like Fall Out Boy, Green Day, or Linkin Park. Now this game just beats out Final Fantasy I for me because I do love me a good job system, but it remains lower on my list for a couple of reasons. I can look back now and see that this was a nice blend of Final Fantasy I and II in many ways, with the job system on top, but the characters added to the DS version seemed to promise this new adventure with new character development when I first played it, but it really ended up just being skins with some minor new backgrounds. That's not to say that there's no lore, no characters in this game. In fact, there is a ton of it, especially with those NPCs. And number 2, this can be one of the most frustrating games in the entire series. In an effort to really highlight the job system in this game, the developers really leaned into needing specific jobs to get through certain areas or bosses. And if you don't know what's going on or you can't figure it out, it just feels like no amount of grinding is giving you the upper hand in this game. I just could not figure out why I was getting demolished after spending so much time grinding. Or maybe I just preferred to be other classes because ninjas are awesome. That being said, if you run this game with a guide or you're willing to figure some of that stuff out and you know how to best prepare for some of these scenarios, the job system in this game was really cool, especially at this time, and I still think it's worth a shot. Like Final Fantasy I, probably the easiest way to get into this game is to check out those pixel remasters. Number 13, Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II.
Final Fantasy.
Not that one, was the first of the Final Fantasy series to introduce named protagonists, as well as the activity-based leveling system rather than your traditional experience point leveling system. And I know this one's a bit controversial, but I actually really enjoyed the uniqueness of this game. Final Fantasy II was originally released in 1998 in Japan on the Famicom, just 1 year after Final Fantasy I. And it is because of this that there are some strong criticisms that this bad boy was a bit rushed out the door due to the unexpected success of the first one, leading to things like poor dungeon designs, a not so great implementation of the leveling system, etc. But we wouldn't see this game in the West until a later time, much like 3. Well, not as late as Final Fantasy III. Specifically, this game came out as Final Fantasy Origins on the PS1, and later on the Game Boy Advance in 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls, and the PSP, and, well, everything else. Most recently, the Pixel Remaster. And this game introduced some of the staples of the series, things like chocobos, which I love, dragoons with their cool armors and spears, the reoccurring character Cid, as well as things like the Ultima spell. The team, of course, the same legendary all-stars from the first and the third, decided to go from the standard leveling system in Final Fantasy I to an activity-based system. What this meant is that every action taken had a chance to level up specific weapon proficiencies, stats, and magic, which you can buy in the game this time, by the way. It's kind of like Skyrim, you know? Final Fantasy 2 was kind of like that, except way less good of a game. Eventually, they would take this leveling system to their Saga franchise, and other games like Legend of Legacy would include something similar, though much more streamlined. The plot of this game revolves around the 4 Warriors of Light. Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon flee from their burning village, getting their butts handed to them, wake up after being saved by Princess Hilda. Leon is gone for some reason. They prove their strength and join the rebellion, and adventure to take on the evil Emperor of Palamacia, who is using Hellspawn to try to destroy everything. Woo! And they're joined by several additional characters as they search for Leon. All of which, well, let's just say they don't stick around for long, and are the focal point of additional content added to the Game Boy Advance version of the game. You know, Dawn of Souls, RIP friends. I played Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Dawn of Souls on the Game Boy Advance in order, and honestly, I loved them both. Maybe it was the form factor, maybe it was the excitement of owning these games for the first time, until I didn't anymore, GameStop. But I loved my time with 2, especially in contrast to 1. You see, I have a problem. My problem is that I love grinding in RPGs. I love that sweet hit of dopamine when you get a level up, skill up, new magic, and when you can bulldoze through bosses. And the leveling mechanic in this game gave me that hit in droves. And I won't get into all the details of the Dawn of Souls content, but I loved that you got to revisit all the other characters that joined you on your journey. I actually enjoyed this one enough to replay on the PSP release, which honestly isn't that surprising considering I did that for all of the PSP releases. That being said, this one is still number 13 on my list because as much as I enjoyed certain elements of this, it could definitely be a slog, especially with some of those dungeon designs. There were so many trap rooms with this higher encounter rate that could be so annoying when all you wanted was that sweet, sweet treasure. And as much as I loved leveling my proficiency, skills, abilities, it could all get a bit too granular, which can easily lead to grinding burnout for people like me. So while this is a unique experience of the franchise, it's definitely not a standout. In fact, I'd say if you've never played the series at all, you could pretty much ignore the first 3 unless you're really curious, but it's probably better to focus on some of the others first. And if you're gonna get in these, of course, like I said before, I would always recommend the Pixel remasters. Number 12, Final Fantasy XV. The Final Fantasy for both fans and first-timers. At least that's what they pushed over and over and over again. This game focused on the journey of Noctis, the crown prince of Insomnia, a fallen kingdom, and his bros. And the marketing for this bad boy was intense. They came out with a movie, an anime series, a bunch of spin-off games, even several mobile games. Final Fantasy XV was released in 2016, 10 years after the development started on a title called Final Fantasy Versus 13, which looked like it was going to be a very different game. The original vision was to develop a darker game in the series that shared the same mythos as Final Fantasy XIII and be developed on the same engine. But there was a shift to this becoming the next mainline Final Fantasy game. There was a change to the next gen consoles that had been announced, and an eventual transition from Tetsuya Nomura to Hajime Tabata directing this project. And with all this transition, the original intro of the game was cut, and much of the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy mythos, based on Final Fantasy XIII, was dramatically reduced to help with marketing. They also switched to a new development engine known as the Luminous engine, which has since been retired. Poor Forspoken would see to that. But one thing that can't be said about this game is that the marketing didn't work. People were hyped about this game. It had sold over 10 million units, making it one of the best-selling Final Fantasy games in the entire franchise. One of the big changes of this game is that the main characters, or the broskies as I like to call them, could travel all across the world of Eos, now a big open world, either in the Regalia, this epic royal car, or with chocobos. Because chocobos with your bros is the best. The world is full of characters, dungeons, side quests, and of course, enemies, including these terrifying demons that would show up at night. Noctis' journey is largely comprised of finding the royal arms, magical weapons of the past kings to rescue the crystal and reclaim his throne after the king was assassinated, and reunite with his love, Lunafreya. The battle system of the base game focused on Noctis as the main fighter and your bros fighting on their own, though this would change a little bit with the DLC. The battle system is described as an action-based, real-time battle system. Basically, instead of the standard menu we've seen in all the previous games, you just have buttons for attacking, defending, and using items. You also have blocks, parry, warping, and a special weapon skill you can use based on what weapon he has equipped at the time. There's also magic and summons in this game, but they were a bit different than previous entries, and some magic is locked behind finding a specific regal weapon for Noctis. And finally, there's the pretty basic ascension grid, or skill tree that you can use to build each of your characters. When it was announced that Versus 13 was changing to 15, honestly, I was just ready to see whatever they would come up with. Having just got a PS4 for Christmas, big win from the wife, I was so ready for this one, and the marketing hooked me like a floppy fish. And don't get me wrong, I liked the game for what it was, but there was a lot of things I didn't love. The story, while having some really awesome moments, felt really fragmented. And while there were some genuinely emotional moments, the ending felt just kind of confusing and dark and unsatisfying. Now, this doesn't mean I think this game isn't worth playing. And the DLC for this game does address almost all the problems in the story by fleshing out characters, showing what happens during some of their absences in the base game, and including areas that were missed in the base game, like Insomnia, the kingdom that fell. But I don't love that it took DLC to fill these gaps. So if you're gonna try this one out, definitely get the Royal Edition. It includes all the DLC. Personally, while I think a remake would be silly this early on in theory, unless you're Sony, if they came out with a definitive edition of this game that somehow merged the DLC into the main story as chapters that play in chronological order, maybe bring some of the DLC improvements into the battle system of the base game or something, I think it would go a long way. It might even push this bad boy way further up my tier list, because the overall package is still pretty good. Number 11, Final Fantasy XIII. Jump back to 2010 and we saw the worldwide release of Final Fantasy XIII. This game was the reason I finally bought a PS3, specifically the Slim when it was less insanely priced. This game promised this massive scale adventure on the worlds of Cocoon and Pulse, with the main character, not Cloud, Lightning and friends, with a new paradigm battle system. The world and lore of 13 was conceptualized by Kazushige Nojima, who had worked on many of the other games in the series, such as 7 and its spin-offs, 8, 10, 10-2, and a bunch of other titles. He specifically came up with what was called the Crystal mythology and worked with Toriyama to create a story where the main characters were kicking against the fate of a predetermined path. Specifically in that there were godlike creatures named Valse who could mark people to do their bidding. If people with the mark, known as Lassie, couldn't figure out their purpose or focus, as it was called, they were turned into an unthinking thrall that would basically just be a monster. If they could succeed in their mission, and good luck to them because they have to figure it out, they would be turned into a crystal, which was understood to be receiving eternal life. You can see why people might not like either of these options. This is the context and plight of the main characters, as the citizens of Cocoon, the floating island which they live in, is controlled by a theocratic government who seeks to purge those who have come in contact with anything from Pulse, the giant land below Cocoon. When the main character Lightning's sister is on a train to be purged because she becomes a Lassie, party works together with a group of resistors to save her. But in doing so, they meet the same Fal'Cie she did, Anima, and all get marked as Lassie themselves, setting them on that predetermined path towards becoming a monster or becoming a crystal, neither of which are good. The paradigm shift I mentioned earlier was a key concept to the battle system for this game. According to the developers, the goal of this new battle system was to take the good from the strategy included in their standard command-based battle system, but allow for more fast-paced strategy that incentivize getting the most out of your skills and attacks. And thus, new classes or roles were created that each character could use individually. But the most important thing was having loadouts for the entire team that you could switch between. This, combined with the fact that enemies would often shift themselves and included a stagger bar that you could break for more damage, made these battles more engaging. The game also spawned an entire trilogy that I won't get into, but some consider 13-2 to be the best in the trilogy, while Lightning Returns, the third one, was, you know, it was a thing. Like I said, I picked up this game and the PS3 in college. I was really looking for an excuse to buy a PS3, and the Slim coming out in September of 2009 and 13 coming out in March of 2010 was more than I could bear. And while this is low on my list, it doesn't mean I think this is trash. As I've had more time to consider it, I think some standout critiques that I have for the game that make it lower on this list are really around the characters in the story. The story is such a jumble of words, terms, concepts, that it was pretty hard to keep track of it all and figure out what the heck was happening. And to be fair, as you continue to play the game, you sort of work it out and figure it out, but you're kind of holding it together the whole time, and then, you know, a few years after you played the game, you have no idea what the heck happened. happened. That being said, this is still above 15 for me because it didn't require DLC to fix some of the holes in the story. It may have been super confusing, but it was complete, and the characters to me just really weren't as compelling as other titles. Lightning as the lead could sort of be all over the place, and characters like Snow, Hope, and Vanille, they just drive me nuts. But even with all of that said, I think both story and characters grew on me over time. The game was and still is beautiful though. And the soundtrack, it was helmed by Masashi Hamauzu, who did an incredible job. It absolutely holds its own against any of the soundtracks of the series. And while I doubt Square would actually do this, I would honestly love a trilogy compilation. Put those things together, drop it on Xbox, Steam, Switch, PS5, I don't care. As long as I can get a physical version, I would be happy. I think that would be great. Number 10, Final Fantasy V. And back we go to the past to Final Fantasy V, as we wade into the swamp of controversy with my top 10. Final Fantasy V brought back the job system from Final Fantasy III, but did so much more. It also introduced one of the best reoccurring characters of the entire series. Final Fantasy V was originally released for the Super Famicom in Japan in 1992. It would eventually be ported to the PlayStation in 1999 alongside 6, and later to the Game Boy Advance in 2006. Along with many later ports and eventually our beloved Pixel Remaster. This game was once again helmed by the legend Sakaguchi, with Tetsuya Nomura on monster designs, Amano back on designs, and the story was a collaboration between Sakaguchi and Kitase, who added more lighthearted elements to the story. And Yumatsu was on music again, coming in hot with another fantastic soundtrack with some of the most iconic tracks in the series. So the party was all here. This game has a simple story revolving around Bart, or Butts, depending on your translation, who along with his trusty chocobo are thrust into the adventure when a giant meteor hits near them. They investigate and find Lena, another main character, eventually Galuf, and later Ferris. The four travel the world and find that the crystals making the world inhabitable have been abused by people living comfortable lives, and they shatter. But not before bestowing upon our warriors of light the power of jobs, the best part of the game. Turns out those crystals were also sealing the main villain, X-Death, who is essentially nature incarnate, coming back for revenge. So the heroes set out to stop him from destroying all of the things. But let's get back to that job system. With each crystal visited in the games, new jobs were unlocked, with more added to the Game Boy Advance version of the game. These jobs have abilities, passive abilities, and abilities that can permanently be learned and set with a different job, so you can mix and match abilities learned. This means there are 1 billion permutations for these characters. Please consult someone with the mathematician job to get some real numbers. But it's a lot of combination. And unlike Final Fantasy III, the game doesn't punish you for experimenting with different combinations of jobs. You're free to mix and match and break the game by combining that sweet dual wield from the ninja with the ranger's rapid fire ability to hit all of the enemies 8 times. Man, I live for this stuff. In this sense, Final Fantasy V perfects what Final Fantasy III introduced. Instead of feeling restricted by combinations of classes required for a specific dungeon or boss fight, you can enjoy the freedom of doing whatever you want, or the crippling need to grind until you learn every single class because you have a problem. Because the initial freelancer job in this game that you start with, well, it gets buffed significantly based on how many jobs you've mastered. I have a problem. I picked this up, of course, when it came out on the Game Boy Advance in 2006. Can we just stop and realize how amazing it was that all of these games were on the Game Boy Advance? I remember at the time doing these long drives to Pasadena in California because I got to be in the Rose Parade. The drive there and back week after week gave me hours of time to play this game. Is it bad to say that that was one of my favorite parts of the Rose Parade? Sorry, Mom. The job system was simultaneously a grind-happy RPG lover's dream and nightmare. With the extra jobs added to the Game Boy Advance version, I found the object art enemies in the basement of the Castle of Ball and mastered every single job. Then blitzed through the rest of the game with my epic freelancer job. This game also introduced Gilgamesh, Xdeath's right-hand man, and with him came one of the best tracks in the series, Battle on the Big Bridge. And the best part about Gilgamesh that some people don't know is that he is usually, canonically, the same exact Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V, whenever he shows up in any other game in the entire series coming from the void. And I love seeing him pop up. So with so much love for for this game, why is it so low on the list? Probably because it shouldn't be, honestly. I do think this game is criminally overlooked. But the major thing that keeps this lower on the list for me is that the story is one of the more bland in the series. Most of the characters don't get much development, with the exception of maybe Ferris and Galuf. Gilgamesh is my favorite character, and he was a villain. But this game will always hold a special place in my heart. Even if it's not in the top 5 for me, I would definitely recommend it. And it's really too bad the Game Boy Advance version isn't as easily accessible anymore outside of, emulation. Because the Pixel Remaster actually removed the extra jobs and dungeons, and I honestly don't understand why they would do that. But that being said, as I mentioned already, you do get those sweet extra features with the Pixel Remaster, so it's hard to go wrong. Not to mention the remaster's soundtrack. Whew, it's a good one. Number 9, Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy IV brought the series into a new era on the Super Nintendo with new iconic music, characters, and a more fleshed out story, motivations, connections, and narrative-driven character classes, and it was this game that would introduce the active time battle system. As for me, once again, I would end up enjoying it later. After Final Fantasy III was released, Square actually planned to make 2 more to follow. One would be on the Famicom, and then there would be another on the Super Famicom. These would have been Final Fantasy IV and V, but budget and time constraints actually caused them to drop the former and turn the Super Famicom game into what we now know as Final Fantasy IV. What would have been Final Fantasy IV has largely been lost to history, except for this excerpt from a Japanese preview that stated that the popular job classes are back with even more classes. Magician, priest, cook, and carpenter, among other jobs, make an appearance. Expect the unexpected. Man, I wish I could take a peek into a parallel universe where this game would have been completed. Jobs would be included in this game, but we wouldn't see cook and carpenter classes until basically Final Fantasy XIV. The themes of this game were going from darkness to light, and that brute strength alone isn't power. These themes combined with bringing in Takashi Tokita, previously pursuing a career as a theater actor, resulted in the first game in the series that really leaned into characters and drama. But this game was made by a team of 14, finished in a year, and was forced to reduce the script due to the cartridge storage limitations at the time. But they still managed to pull off a classic in the series. Tokita later admitted that the result of all this meant that the story could be unclear at times or not looked at in depth, such as the constant characters dying but not really trope in this game, and there was an entire dungeon cut that would have required each individual character to progress. But that would be added back in for the Game Boy Advance version. This game also included a beautiful new soundtrack by the legendary Uematsu, and this game was the first in the series, like I said, to introduce that active time battle system. And this resulted in needing to think on your feet during battles. No longer did enemies wait for you to figure out how you were going to kill them. They were going to go down swinging. So while I wouldn't consider this game hard by any means, the battles did become more interesting when you had to think fast. Final Fantasy IV would come to the West as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, because they kept dropping the ball on getting localization for the previous entries. And this is not the version I would personally recommend. I didn't play this game, of course, until it was remastered on the, you guessed it, Game Boy Advance. I know, surprise, surprise. And I fell in love with this game. It was by far one of my favorites on the Game Boy Advance. And I would go on to play almost every re-release of this game, including the PSP, DS, and the Pixel remasters. I remember at that time feeling so blown away by getting a new Game Boy Advance SP with a backlit screen, getting to play this Final Fantasy masterpiece on the go. This was also the game where I discovered that I had been described by some friends as a person with a stupid amount of luck when I was grinding in the game with a friend of mine to find this item needed for the best armor in the game. It was about a 1.5% chance of dropping from a rare enemy, so you can imagine most people would just quit, but not us. And in about 30 minutes to an hour or so, I got 2 of them. My friend took much longer to find 1. I don't know why he was so mad. You should be happy for me, right? So why number 9? 4 does so much right, but things like story, characters, the ATB system would be much improved on over time. So while I liked it more than 5, it's hard for me to put this game any higher than the rest of my list. That being said, play this game. While I am a big fan of the Pixel remasters, especially the music, oh man, that music. I think the PSP version is the best. The DS version was interesting with the 3D visuals, but the PSP had a great art style, included all the additional content from the GBA version, and included new content called the Interlude and the After Years, all in one pack, both of which give additional story for how the characters and their children developed after the main storyline of the game. I can't stress enough how much I love these games, and I would once again recommend it to anybody interested. Number 8, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy in the new era where Kitase would take more direct leadership, and Uematsu was no longer the sole composer for the games. And Sakaguchi would soon move on to give us some other amazing games that I talk about in this video. The launch of this game was a pivotal point for Square, as they needed to prove that the evolution of this franchise could work. And not only did they pull this off, but this game is arguably one of the most impactful RPGs of the PlayStation 2 era. As mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy X was announced at the Square Millennium event alongside 9 and 11. 10 was the first Final Fantasy to hit the PS2, and it wowed all of the onlookers with its more realistic take on the visual style. It released in December of 2001 to very high praise. It was the first of the series to include voice acting, and it went from fully pre-rendered backdrops to mostly three-dimensional areas, with a few pre-rendered areas mixed in. And while this wasn't the first Final Fantasy to include cutscenes, this game took it to a whole new level, as it was very story-focused, with a minimum of 8 hours of those cutscenes. As for the music, Uematsu was involved, but joined by Masashi Hamautsu and Junya Nakano, and the soundtrack they came up with for this game is absolutely one of the best. I love all the Final Fantasy soundtracks, but tracks like Xanarkand, Calm Before the Storm, Auron's theme, not to mention one of the main themes, Suteki Dane, are some of the series' standouts. This game also went from the active time battle system and switched to a conditional turn-based system, where players can see the turn order and strategically work to impact the order in their favor with things like haste. Characters could also be swapped in and out of the party during the battle with no penalty, which may sound like it should be assumed, but it definitely was not for this time. The only downside is that only the characters that were in battle got the experience to level up, making it a bit more complicated to keep everyone at the same level. And then they added the sphere grid. This allowed players to choose how to build their characters by choosing spheres to level up stats, gain abilities, magic, etc. Oh man, this thing was a game breaker's dream, because late game you could literally break the damage cap and hit 99,999 damage. And while Wakka wasn't my personal favorite character in the game, he had an attack reel that could hit 12 times if done correctly. So yeah, 1.2 million damage in one turn. That's insane. Otherwise, there were puzzles included to break up the pacing between events and battles, as well as, of course, minigames, like Blitzball. Anyway, as for me, I picked this one up years after it came out, since I was late to the Final Fantasy party. It was far enough past release that I went into some random hobby shop and the guy was selling it for like 10 bucks. So I grabbed it immediately, of course, and I dove right in. The story of this game is really what got me hooked. While Final Fantasy X starts with Tidus, I refuse to call him Tidus, the real main character is actually Yuna. Her pilgrimage is the driving point of this entire story. And yet there's some really interesting twists between these two as you carry on. I'll say this. That intro scene with all the characters sitting around a fire with Xanarkand playing in the background really set the tone for this game. And Tidus, being the only renameable character in the party, may have more significance than you may realize. I also remember getting some of these tracks off of LimeWire. Anybody remember that garbage? Now, as much as I love this game, there are several things that knock it down on the list for me, mostly related to the boss battles and getting the ultimate weapons. Look, I'm sorry, but if you make me dodge 200 lightning bolts where I have to count in my head and get it right without fail just to get a stupid stuffed animal ultimate weapon, I'm gonna be a little mad. But that wasn't even it. You also had to break records with chocobo racing. Admittedly, the music was great. And do things like Blitzball to get Wakka's weapon. Of course I'm going to do it, but man, is this the worst part of the game for me. And some of the bosses, specifically Seymour and Yunalesca, felt like imbalanced punishments at some point, especially Yunalesca with her Megadeth attack. Ugh. And there are some other small gripes here that I have, but I don't want to take away from the fact that even though this is 8 on my list, this could easily be in the top 3 for anyone else, and I wouldn't bat an eye. This is a great game and absolutely stands the test of time. Number 7, Final Fantasy XVI. Phew, I can hear the clackety-clack of some of those comments right now. Final Fantasy XVI is your number 7? Are you mad? Yes, I am. Listen, I know this is going to be a controversial take because this game is very different from the rest of the series. But in my opinion, this is one of the strongest set of characters and stories in the entire franchise. And I'll admit, it was the characters and stories that carried this game for me. But I also found the combat to be quite enjoyable and fulfilling once you got the hang of things. And let's be real, 16 is absolutely what happened if you took a story arc out of 14 and plugged it into a single player game. Final Fantasy 16 was released in 2023 and was helmed by Naoki Yoshida, otherwise known as Yoshi P, and a team largely comprised of the 14 team, as well as members of the Evil East team, not to mention development support from the Kingdom Hearts team, and the 7 Remake team, in addition to additional staff from Platinum Games. They also brought back Amano from the classic games to design the logo, including Ifrit and Phoenix, and included Soken, the composer from Final Fantasy XIV, for the soundtrack. And he continues to work on epic soundtracks for Final Fantasy XIV. In short, this is an all-star team. The team took criticisms from Final Fantasy XV, specifically criticisms around the open world and issues with the story, and worked to build a game that would be a visual showcase for the PS5 with more straightforward combat, a beautiful, though less open world, and a narrative that spoke to all audiences as they stepped away from the teenage party saving the world trope. Thus, Final Fantasy XVI, a mature, gritty, and narratively rich game was born. This game is set in the world of Valse, a world that is filled with the mother crystals that grant power to some called dominants, who embody the power of classic Final Fantasy summons, like Shiva, Bahamut, Titan, and others. And it becomes very clear right out the gate that dominants are basically each nation's nuclear weapon. When dominants transform and fight, nobody wins. Slavery is also a very strong theme in this game, as those who can wield magic are branded and oppressed, often forced to work until they essentially turn to glass by overuse of magic. This dark fantasy setting shows its clear influences from series like Game of Thrones right out the gate as you wade through betrayal, power struggles, and of course those who would oppose it all. Very early, Clive, the main character, has a chance encounter with Cid of this game, the best Cid in the series in my opinion, reunites with Jill, a long-lost friend and the love interest of the story, as well as Torgal, his hound, who is more than meets the eye, and absolutely one of the best doggos in any game, and he just gets better. And then there is the combat. Probably one of the most controversial parts of this game, Yoshi P took to the fanbase and saw a split between those who wanted turn-based or ATB battles again, and those who preferred a more action RPG approach. Looking at the market, there was evidence enough to show that the more action-oriented approach would make this game more accessible to the masses, and of course, Square Enix is trying to make money, so he brought on Capcom legend Ryota Suzuki of Devil May Cry fame as the battle system designer. And what we got was a battle system that focused just on Clive for simplicity, with loyal Torgal always at his side, and the others were AI-controlled companions that joined throughout the story. Torgal's such a good boy. Clive gains iconic powers, or powers from the different summons, that essentially represent different classes without being called classes. They do all have pros and cons, such as Phoenix having attacks that heal, or Garuda having fast attacks that can stagger enemies so you can follow up with others like Titan to dish out massive damage. Torgal helps and can heal too. See? I can't overstate how good of a boy Torgal is. With these abilities, it all comes down to building up combos, staggering enemies, dodging attacks, and eventually wrecking all the things. And I should probably touch on the side quests, since those are also constantly criticized. I did every single one of the side quests, and honestly, I'm really glad I did. So much of this world, the conflict, the impact of the current system of injustice, all come together between the main narrative and the side quests to make a full and rich narrative that can't be enjoyed in full without going through those side quests. That being said, you don't need to do all the side quests to enjoy this game. This is just a personal thing for me. I loved doing them, and if someone were to ask, I would actually recommend seeing them through. I went back and forth on where I should place this game on the ranking list. I even considered it for my top 5, but there are a couple of things that hold me back. First, after reflection, I realized that this game lacks a lot of the character from previous entries in the franchise because they lean so hard into the M rating. And because of this, you lose some of that levity and even some of the fun side quests and mini games. And the tone of this game just really doesn't let up very often. Second, because of this, the world itself can just feel oppressively bleak at times. It's not that it's bland or uninteresting, but a large part of the plot is spent in dark, atmospheric, and tragic locations, and even in some of the more beautiful areas, you are constantly reminded of the severe injustice and tragedy of the Branded. It's not bad necessarily, it can just feel really weighty. That, and I think this world, even with its limitations, could have been done in a much more rewarding way, where as you explore, there are different nooks and crannies that you can go find in towns or the overworld, where you're actually rewarded with considerable upgrades or items, and even other surprises, whereas most of the exploring in 16 was met with either no items or nothing really of consequence. Again, all that said, like every game on my list, I loved this game, and honestly, I would love if Yoshi P could continue to be involved, especially when it comes to narrative and characters and world building. Personally, for me, this is one of my favorite games of 2023. So check it out on the PS5 if you haven't already, and I believe this one's coming to the PC in the future as well. Number 6, Final Fantasy VIII. This is one I keep coming back to over and over and over again. This is the game that got me into the franchise, and I absolutely love it. It also stands as one of the most unique games in the franchise, as the gameplay mechanics weren't repeated in any other Final Fantasy game, and maybe not any other RPG in general. Final Fantasy VIII was published in 1999 in the States, just 2 years after 7. As a side note, it is crazy that we used to get mainline Final Fantasy games in this short of a time frame. And it followed a similar style in that it was more mature story with more realistic aesthetics. The story follows Squall, a moody protagonist with his trusty gunblade, one of the coolest weapons in the series, who is an orphan and now resides in a military school known as Balam Garden, where he and many others go through a program to graduate into a mercenary force called Seed, who conducted missions around the world, protected citizens, and ultimately are tasked with taking down an evil sorceress. But this game would also include a parallel story following a mysterious character named Laguna and his crew that would culminate in later parts of the game. Sakaguchi was less directly involved in this game, taking on an executive producer role, leaving the main direction to Yoshinori Kitase, while he worked on Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, a CGI movie that would come out later. We wouldn't have Lost Odyssey without this mistake. Like I said earlier, this game would have one of the most unique battle systems in the entire franchise, and for some people, it's probably best left here. But not for this guy! Seed Mercenaries had access to Guardian Forces, or GFs, which were essentially your summons from other Final Fantasy games. With these GFs came the infamous junctioning system, which allowed players to choose what additional actions the characters could use, such as items, magic, or summoning, and they also allowed you to draw magic from enemies and draw points, which were treated more like items in the sense that you have a limited amount and assigned that magic to a stat to increase it depending on the tier of magic and how many you have. For example, if you're crazy like me, maybe you spend the entire beginning taking hits from enemies just so that you could draw the max amount of fire, blizzard, cure, just so you could beef up some of those stats right out the gate. GFs could also individually level up and gain AP that could be allocated for a wide range of skills like stat boosts, abilities, and even the ability to change the game, like encounter none skills, or being able to change cards you can get from this mini-game called Triple Triad into items. And don't skip this, by the way, that game was super fun. In addition to GFs, the leveling system was altered to a flat rate of 1,000 experience per level versus your standard level scaling that requires more experience. But in addition to this, enemies would scale up with you, with the exception of some bosses who had level caps to prevent the game from becoming impossible to progress. And let's not forget to talk about that incredible soundtrack. I have nothing but good things to say about this entire series for the incredible soundtracks, but Uematsu went hard on this one with tracks like Liberi Fatale, Man with a Machine Gun, and Don't Be Afraid, which was done in 5/8 time. It's so fun to conduct and dance to. What? Nobody else does that? Seriously, look up these tracks and don't sleep on the versions done by the Black Mages. I've made reference to this in some of my other videos, but this was the first game that got me into the franchise and RPGs as a whole. The story is essentially that I had a friend who loved these games, and I used to make fun of her. Ooh, fantasy, huh? I would scoff like an absolute idiot, until one day she essentially told me to sit down, shut up, and play Final Fantasy VIII. And my entire gaming life changed at that moment. I became obsessed with this game. Over the coming weeks, I would scrounge up lunch money by not buying food at school and asking my friends if they were gonna finish that breadstick or not. What? A man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. And after several weeks, I finally got my mom to take me to GameStop, where she would be confused to find that she needed to come in because her son was trying to purchase a PS2 Slim. And at that point, I devoured the entire series, almost like those excellent leftover breadsticks. But for all my love for this game and its special place in my heart, if I'm trying to be objective, I can see why this one is a bit more controversial. While in theory, the junction system, the flat experience requirement, the enemy level scaling should balance itself out, in practice, this was not the case at all. As a grinder by trade, I found myself having some serious problems about mid-game with some of the standard enemies in the overworld. I wouldn't say this is game-breaking by any means, but that balance doesn't come as naturally as it should, when sometimes progression and story can feel a bit out of sync, depending on how much you've overleveled. But the story and music will keep you going, and even finding some of those optional GFs was super fun. The overall experience is still fantastic, and I would highly recommend it. Oh, and did I mention that our boy Gilgamesh shows up in this one as well? Yep. Same one. And Final Fantasy VIII is available just about everywhere, and it's not a game you should miss. Number 5, Final Fantasy VI. Alert, alert, Final Fantasy VI is not in your top 4. So what? It's an amazing game. I'm just about to talk about. It doesn't matter. You have broken one of the laws of being a Final Fantasy fan. What? Fans have all kinds of different opinions. And it's not like I'm hating on this game. Because it is not in your top 3. Hey, you said top 4. Shut up. Because it is not in your top 3, you are not a true fan, and the internet will agree with me. What? Go away. People understand there are different opinions and will act reasonably in the comments, right? Right? Final Fantasy VI is, in my opinion, hands down the best of the pixel era. And this game is crazy. You want an epic opera scene crashed by a crazed octopus? How about zany characters with surprisingly tragic backstories? How about a boss fight where a character can literally pick up a train and drop it on its head? Or how about a villain that is completely insane and actually breaks stuff? Or how about an entire village that gets poisoned and dies? Wait. That escalated quickly. Final Fantasy VI was released in the US in 1994 as Final Fantasy III on the SNES. And for many who played the original Final Fantasy III, this game was magnificent. Even well after this time period, it's still one of the best, but imagining discovering games like this and Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and so many more back then would have been incredible, which is why I've gone back and I continue to do so. One of the things that makes this game so special is that the team decided that they wanted every playable character to be a protagonist in this game. They all had backgrounds, ambitions, or reasons for fighting, and it made the cast feel so much more alive. When you think of this game, who comes to your mind first? To achieve this, all of the members of the development team came up with ideas for characters and scenarios for the overall plot, and Kitase, one of the directors of this game, would bring it all together. So, to name a few, you had Sakaguchi coming up with Terra and Locke, Kitase coming up with Celis and Gao, Nomura coming up with Shadow and Setzer, and Tanaka, who came up with Edgar and Sabin. And with each of these beloved characters conceptualized with stories included, Kitase had the difficult task of bringing it all together into an overarching plot provided by Sakaguchi. And what we got was an incredible, epic, dark, intense, and hilarious game. And we can't forget about Kefka, easily one of the most memorable villains in a Final Fantasy game, let alone any RPG. He made this story downright shocking, especially for the time. And of course, to carry it all through was the music of our beloved Uematsu, who wrote not only some of the most iconic tracks for this game, but he literally wrote a small opera for a scene where the characters had to trick Setzer so they can sneak on a ship but are attacked by a crazy octopus. And of course, the epic Dancing Mad boss battle theme. Combat in this game was built on the ATB system introduced in Final Fantasy IV, and each character essentially has a class, like 4, that gives them each a special ability. But this time there were more experimental characters, like Edgar, who has what would be considered a mechanist class, allowing him to buy and use tools for special attacks, as well as Terra and Celis, who were similar to a Mystic Knight, but distinct. Celis is a Rune Knight, allowing her to use both magic and weapons effectively, and including the ability to absorb magic from enemies to restore MP, while Terra is a magical knight who's similar, but can learn magic from leveling up, unlike other characters, and can turn into an Esper with her trance. And Terra can be an absolute unit in this game. In addition to the special abilities each character has, magic, stat boost, and summoning could be achieved by finding and equipping Espers in this game. That is, the standard Final Fantasy summons like Ifrit, Shiva, Bahamut, etc. Because of this, many recommend that you don't level up very much in the beginning of the game so that you can maximize the stat boost provided from leveling up with an Esper equipped later. I absolutely loved this game. Alongside Final Fantasy Tactics, I actually played this version with a friend. We literally just handed the controller off to the other to control specific characters. But I didn't finish this game in full until, you guessed it, the Game Boy Advance. I see Final Fantasy on the Game Boy Advance, I buy Final Fantasy on the Game Boy Advance. And I know a lot of people want a remake for this game, but here's my hot take, if you will. I'm not actually sure this game would translate well in a full-on 3D remake, a la Final Fantasy VII. If you play this game, one of the key elements of it is its charm and how ridiculous it can be at times. The opera scene is crashed by a giant talking octopus, and later you will fight that same crazy octopus with a flying monster on a ship only to jump off and get into another fight with a giant ship, all falling from the sky. And this works in the context, because the game doesn't often take itself too seriously. But honestly, I would just love to see something more like an HD 2D remake with new assets, quality of life features, maybe voice acting, but the pixel style lends itself so well to that kind of silliness in this game. So why didn't this crack the top 3 for me? Well, frankly, it's just that these 5 spots are super close for me, and a lot of it boiled down to how much fun I personally had playing the game. I know this one will be at the top of the list for a lot of people, and I absolutely respect that. I love this game, and if you haven't played this, I would highly recommend the Pixel Remaster, available on just about every platform. I'm sure there's some differing opinions on where the best version of this game is, but the music alone is worth the remaster for me, especially the opera scene. Number 4, Final Fantasy XII. Even though Final Fantasy X was the turning point for this series, Final Fantasy XII, to me, felt like the series really took that next step forward. This world felt lived in, and it was the first to introduce fully rotating cameras, meaning you could explore in a way that previously was unseen in any of the Final Fantasy games. It may have had some issues, which I'll come back to, but I keep coming back to this one over and over again. This game came out in 2006 and was the first new Final Fantasy game release that I had been a part of, and it came with a demo disc included in Dragon Quest VIII. Also an amazing game, but this isn't a Dragon Quest list. This game was led by Yasumi Matsuno of Final Fantasy Tactics fame, as well as Hiroyuki Ito, the director of Final Fantasy IX, and the game was set in Ivalice, the same world as Tactics, though the plot is in the far past, giving it the ability to keep its own distinct style and lore. And man, was the presentation for this game amazing. The soundtrack also had tracks from Final Fantasy Tactics, giving it a different feel as a whole, but still really good. All the towns and locations had so much to them, so many characters, many of which had side quests, and so many places to explore. This was a version of Ivalice that was a blast to spend time in. And apparently Vagrant Story is set in Ivalice? Man, I really need to get to that game. The inspiration for the design of this game came from medieval Mediterranean countries, and the localization team did an incredible job getting voice actors with different accents to represent the different regions and peoples. As for the battle system, the team wanted to get away from the classic turn-based system, deciding instead to revamp the ATB system mixed with auto battling, just-in-time command mechanics, as well as automating your party's AI with the Gambit system. The Gambit system allowed you to set priorities for certain actions based on set circumstances. For example, if you wanted to make sure your characters were always healed up when their HP hit a certain percentage, say 60%, you could set a Gambit. This automated the process, and you could be certain that the set character would heal right then, whether that be with magic or an item. While this system could take some getting used to, and it had some flaws, getting to set things up, especially for big battles or hunts, and watch the magic happen for your team was so satisfying. Speaking of hunts, this game also included mini bosses you can go hunt down for experience and rewards, which was an incredible incredibly fun way to change the pace of the game and get to some amazing battles, like our old friend Gilgamesh from Final Fantasy V. And yep, canonically, same one. Finally, this game included a sphere grid-like character growth system, but this time it's a license board. The idea of the license board came from the fact that the land is ruled by judges, meaning you earn the right to use your abilities. In Zodiac Age, the re-release of this game, the license board would forego the general board in favor of specific classes and subclasses that your characters can choose from to learn new abilities. Now, the area of this game that most agree falters is the payoff of the story and of the characters. There can be a distinct lack of, let's say, emotion in the story, and the character stories never quite felt finished, leaving them to ultimately become a bit more forgettable than some of the other beloved characters in the series. This happens most abruptly in the second half of the game, and it's led to many rumors about what was actually supposed to have happened due to the fact that Matsuno had to bow out of the project a year or so before the release due to health reasons. While the team was restructured and some tweaks were made, Matsuno actually shot down the most prevalent rumor that the character Bosch was supposed to be the main character, and everything got changed when he left. But don't let the story elements deter you from playing this game. It is one of the best in terms of gameplay, and I found myself coming back to it time and time again, like I said, and will probably continue doing so. Everything combined, it is just so much fun to play, and the world building is so strong. Honestly, the story makes me wish that they took another crack at this game, or maybe the world itself. Not necessarily another remaster or remake, but rather a game in the same world with similar upgraded mechanics and a new story with more character connection and emotional impact. And here's my hot take from this one that you will probably not hear from anybody else. I actually prefer the original to the Zodiac Age. Don't get me wrong, the Zodiac Age is an amazing remaster, and I'd say it's the best way to play for any newcomer of the game. But the Zodiac Age removed all of the ways that I could break the game in the original. So I'll give you an example. After beating the game for the first time, I found out that I was able to get the best spear in the game if I could run through this crazy high-level area called the Necro Hall of Nabudis and grab it. In the original, there was this crazy requirement that you had to not open very specific chests for it to show up in the Necro Hall. Or you could run through like a madman, grab it, and try to make it out of there alive before you could even make that mistake. Once I did that, I did some grinding to get the license and battled some werewolves in the beginning by spamming these super moves called quickenings until a kotetsu dropped, which was a katana, and it was about as strong as the 10th best one-handed sword in the game that could increase the ability to auto-attack more than once. And then I would just bulldoze through the game, like completely defeating the demon wall in literally one hit. I also like the flexibility of being able to do anything with any of the characters by unlocking the entire license board. Understandably, the original license board was not everybody's cup of tea, but I really liked it. But this for me is like the opposite of Final Fantasy XVI. 12's strength is absolutely in the battle mechanics and the fun of the game, and not necessarily so much its story. I think this one can often get overlooked or take on criticism that doesn't necessarily account for how downright fun this game is to play. Whether you hit the original or the Zodiac Age, you're in for a treat, and if you haven't picked this one up, I would highly recommend it. Number 3, Final Fantasy VII. If Final Fantasy VIII opened my eyes to RPGs in general, Final Fantasy VII is the game that made me a lifelong fan of this series. This game was a major step forward into the 3D era of Final Fantasy and would combine a mysterious and compelling story, great characters, a fun world to explore, mini-games like those in the Golden Saucer, Chocobo racing was particularly addicting, and one of the most terrifying, interesting, and iconic villains in gaming history. If this was what the Final Fantasy series had to offer, I was going to binge the whole thing. And I did. The history of this game is very interesting. The initial conceptual discussion for this game started all the way back in 1994 after Final Fantasy VI was finished. But development paused after creating the initial prototype for the game so the team could help finish Chrono Trigger. Thank you very much, Final Fantasy VII team. This prototype for 7 was actually a 2D prototype designed for the SNES, which would have been the safer path forward, but the team was interested in the riskier 3D path as they saw the industry moving in that direction. Once decided, the team looked into the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn, even creating a full-on 3D test demo for the 64. Nintendo was the first choice for testing, of course, because Square was practically a second-party developer at that time, with some executives stating that working there was akin to working at Nintendo. But the 64 testing wouldn't go as expected, with issues from both the 64 cartridge storage and cost, not to mention the frame rate impact from some of their tests with models for some of their bosses. So in a move that shocked the industry, they moved development to the PlayStation, temporarily burning that bridge with Nintendo, and solidifying a new era for the series. The 3D era of Final Fantasy games wouldn't show up on a Nintendo console again until the surprise announcement of a special DLC character for Smash on the Wii U, Cloud Strife. This was a historical shift, as after this we got 7 through 12 released on the Switch. And I'm sure we will see other ports or remasters in the future as well. 13 trilogy, anybody? How about 15? How about 7 remake? Let's go! The story of this game also went through several iterations, as the initial concept was set in New York City, where the party was blowing up Mako reactors and would be pursued by a detective named Joe. Poor Joe. He would never see the light of day again. This concept would eventually shift, but the core of it was actually kept and used as the basis for a more experimental game, Parasite Eve, which was built on the Final Fantasy VII engine. Around this time, the concept of the life stream was introduced, as Sakaguchi saw the theme of life as a way of coping with the passing of his mother. The team also decided to focus the narrative around one character as opposed to the direction of Final Fantasy VI. This by no means meant that the other characters had less importance, but that the narrative would revolve around Cloud Strife, a character with an interesting backstory that would unravel over the game, revealing some mental health trauma connected to another important character, Zack. They also decided, in contrast to the theme of life, that they needed the theme of death. This related to the use of Mako energy killing the planet and one of the most shocking twists in video game history. The death... Sorry. Why can't I say Final Fantasy VII is almost 30 years old. How is it spoiler? But with all the creative energy and ideas going into this, they had timeline constraints. So characters like Yuffie and Vincent, who were supposed to be a part of the main plot, were moved to being side characters. It sounds like while what we got was incredible, there could have been so much more given the time to do so. The gameplay in this game is not much different from its predecessor at a fundamental level, as you still had your ATB system in battle. However, the graphical enhancements in this game were immense. Characters and enemies actually moved to and fro to attack one another. Magic was rendered in sweet 3D, and you had full-on cutscenes for summons. Yes, Square, I would love to wait a whole minute as I summon Knights of the Round for the 60th time, literally taking 1 hour out of my game time just to watch summons. The main difference in this game is it introduced the materia system, which would also play a significant role in the story, and limit breaks. Materia could be equipped with each weapon having a certain number of slots to add to, and this would determine the character's magic, special abilities, or stat increases. Limit breaks, special attacks that dished out large amounts of damage, could also be learned by completing certain objectives. And finally, Uematsu was back for this one, and by some this is considered his best work. Definitely top 3. Uematsu took inspiration from the more cinematic experience of the 3D visuals on the PlayStation to make music that was more like a movie soundtrack than individual themes that would define the game. His compositions would be written with scenes in mind rather than specific characters. Like that. Come on, son. Many of the amazing tracks in this game can be commented on, but I have to highlight One Wing Angel. This masterpiece was both inspired by classical music, with strong inspiration from Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. Seriously, just get to Movement 2, Auguries of Spring, and it's pretty obvious. As well as rock from the 60s and 70s. He spent time writing short, unconnected musical phrases and then later brought it all together into this iconic song that is best on display, in my opinion, in the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children soundtrack, where he was able to use a full orchestra, choir, and the Black Mages, baby! Have you noticed I'm a fan of the Black Mages? After 8, I plunged into this game and went wild for everything that came after. Or before, as the case may be. When the compilation of Final Fantasy VII was announced and Advent Children, the sequel movie, was coming to the US, I was so hyped for it when I found someone with the Japanese version with subs on their MySpace page. Yeah. Remember MySpace? And I watched it over and over again. I also dove into Dirge Cerberus on the PS2, which I now know was created with adding more of Vincent's story in mind, as well as, of course, Crisis Core on the PSP. Then they showed up with the tech demo on the PS3, and I was super hyped for that. And it totally primed us all for the eventual remake to come. And now the remake trilogy turns out to actually be a sequel to Advent Children. And this is a point of confusion I see a lot. To be fair, the marketing in term remake is confusing, but these are not intended to replace the original, but rather to expand on the original. I am going to agree with this comment from Corndog9482 that I got on this video. Thanks, buddy. He said one that needs a proper one-to-one remaster is Final Fantasy VII its original format, without being released episodically, and it being some sort of lame gacha game. Old Corndog here is spot on. As much as I love this series, I hate Ever Crisis on principle. If you like it, no judgment, enjoy your game. But for me, it represents what could have been, specifically an actual one-to-one remaster of Final Fantasy VII, with new models and assets to make the original look more modern yet retro, and with battles that transition into the remake assets, while maintaining the original ATB battle system. The original had blocky characters that had a more mature design when you got into battle, and it worked. So why not replace the blocky characters with the art style you have in Ever Crisis, and make the battles look like remake, with the remake style music? Anyway, as much as I love this game and all of its spin-offs, I won't pretend like nostalgia and Square's constant push to keep this world alive doesn't have a huge impact on its placement in my top 3. But there's a reason this game and this world is so iconic. The original was and is an incredible game, and I would still highly recommend it, especially in its current touched-up remastered form on just about every console. The remaster also includes ways to speed up some of what slowed down the original game. So regardless of whether or not you're in on the remake trilogy, check the original out. And if you like it, go down the 7 rabbit hole just like I did. Number 2, Final Fantasy XIV. Alright, this one does feel a little bit like cheating because it's actually several games in one package. And I know MMOs are not for some of you, but if you have the time and the money to sink into this game, what you'll find is one of the most, if not the most, Final Fantasy of all Final Fantasy games. This game is a treasure trove of storytelling, music, oh, the music, silliness, epic battles, so many references to the entire franchise, and just sweet joy. I'll not be able to fully capture the incredibleness of this game in such a short segment because this game could spawn hours-long videos by itself, and I know it has. The original Final Fantasy XIV was released in 2010 and was a complete failure, commercially and critically. But one man stood up to bring this game up from the grave at great financial risk. Probably more risky not to fix it. And that man was Naoki Yoshida. Yoshi P led the team to start work on version 2.0, now known as A Realm Reborn, where they would switch engines, revamp the gameplay, interface, story, etc. But when A Realm Reborn came out, it was done brilliantly. On November 11th, 2012, the original game was shut down with a full cutscene that ended in a trailer for A Realm Reborn. What a way to go down and build hype at the same time. Shortly after, alpha access for A Realm Reborn was open. The story picked up where the original left off, treating the actual events of the game, failure and shutdown, as an actual narrative calamity, and beginning A Realm Reborn with hope for the future. And it worked! In a crazy turn of events, 14 not only surged to life, but it has continued to build with each major expansion, making this game one of the greatest comeback stories of all time. During the restoration process, Yoshi P made it very clear that sales were secondary to redeeming the reputation of the series through communication and regaining the trust of the players. And he, to this day, has followed a strategy of constantly communicating with players. But he also focused on making sure the game's playability was a priority. One key focus was on appealing to hardcore MMO players as well as newcomers to the genre. Because of that newcomer focus, Yoshi P and the team prioritized controller play as well as your standard keyboard setup. And while some may always prefer the keyboard setup, I can confirm after hundreds of hours in this game, and 90% of my playtime being on a controller, that it is designed really, really well. In addition to this, the team would target the standard MMO issue of dungeons and raids taking forever by implementing a duty finder system, which made it much easier to connect with other players, even across servers. Later, the trust system was implemented that even allowed players to run dungeons and bosses with in-game characters from the story, essentially allowing for a full single-player experience. And finally, the team continues to put out full-on story expansions to bring old players back, and boy does it work. No matter how long it's been since I've played, new story always brings me back. This game is largely set in the land of Eorzea, which includes Gridania, a forest-like area, the Sultanic Ul'dah, the desert area, Limsa Lominsa, the maritime empire, and Ishgard, an isolated and snowy theocracy. While A Realm Reborn focuses primarily on Ul'dah, Gridania, and Limsa, expansions like Heavensward take the player to areas like Ishgard. Your characters, the Warriors of Light, arrive in the world of 14 and are soon greeted by a plethora of amazing characters that continue to contribute to the many expansions worth of story. Leaders from each area are introduced in addition to the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, a nation-agnostic organization that has a focus on preventing a new calamity from coming to the land. Primarily, primarily by stopping the machinations of the Asians, who are a mysterious group of dark-hooded hooligans doing mischievous things like summon enemies, conspiring with enemy nations, possess even your allies to do evil, and, you know, summon ancient monster machines to blow up the planet. And this is just the basis of the story, mind you. As a warrior of light and one of the scions, you work with the group to unify nations, protect the peoples, and discover what's happening behind the scenes to often find deeper and darker truths about what's going on in the world. The warrior of light has a special power called the Echo that allows them to resonate with people's souls to see, though not change, their past. This often allows the player to learn more about motivations or key information that helps the group move forward. And finally, there are the classes and jobs in this game. One of the most amazing things about this game is that unlike many other MMOs, your character can be as many classes or jobs as you want to run. The way it works is that you choose a class to start with. For me, it was the pugilist. As you progress through the story and exploration, you can find and unlock new classes, and once you hit level 30, you can upgrade to a more advanced job. In my case, that was monk, until they introduced ninja, and samurai, and now the viper job. But if you're not a DPS addict like I am, you can run tank, DPS, or healer classes, or multiple of each, depending on what you want to switch into at any time. And I didn't even talk about the jobs of hand, where you can make all kinds of things. I was so hyped when this game came out in 2013 on the PS3. I bought the deluxe edition that came with some pretty cool stuff, and I got into the beta, which was a bit of a dumpster fire when trying to log in. And over the 11 years at this point, I've just kept coming back. I know MMOs aren't for everyone because they tend to be huge, they're much slower pacing, even just the travel, but this game is unbelievably good. Each expansion just gets better and better, and the story almost feels like your favorite show, but you get to keep coming back and you get to keep spending time with that amazing cast. It's one of the best things about this game. Every MMO I've ever played was super fun to play with friends, but the story was never really a focus. Maybe with WoW as an exception, of course, but this game has some of the best storytelling of the entire series. And now that you can run it effectively single player, it's such a great game to jump into. It may take some adjustment for those not familiar with MMOs, but it is absolutely worth it. And the sheer amount of content is insane at this point. And I can't not talk about Soken, who was the composer for these games. Soken also did 16, like I mentioned earlier, but no offense to Soken at all, 16 to me felt like a watered down version of what he pulls off here in 14. A lot of people think the 16 soundtrack is amazing, and it is. But if you think the 16 soundtrack is amazing, check out the 14 soundtrack. Each expansion of this game is filled with his absolutely epic, experimental, thematic styles, and it just continues to build. By the time you get to Endwalker, the theme hits notes from every single expansion, making the music carry the entire history of the game with it. And music like this has such a great impact on the player who's experienced all of the story because it just reminds you of the entirety of the experience. Like I said, I could gush about this game all day. If I could have one crazy wish granted, it would be that Square committed to turning this game into single-player installments. Imagine a Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, Endwalker, Dawntrail, all reimagined and turned into a single player, maybe keep some of those multiplayer components, game that maintains the core story and treat the main characters as characters in your party. Things would need to be scaled down and tightened up a bit, but I would throw all of my money at this, just for a chance to relive and play new stories from 14. And those Final Fantasy fans who missed this game would get a chance to see what I'm talking about. Again, just like Dragon Quest X offline, this is possible, though again, I doubt it's going to happen anytime soon, if ever. Number 1, Final Fantasy IX. To me, Final Fantasy IX is the heart and soul of this franchise. This game encapsulates so much of what I love from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy VIII, and it celebrates the entire series up to that point. If Final Fantasy XIV is the MMO celebration of the series, this feels like the single-player celebration of the series. Final Fantasy IX was released in November of 2000, and it went back to the medieval fantasy roots that started the franchise, in contrast to 7 and 8. This was deliberate, as Sakaguchi wanted to create a game that recaptured the spirit and settings of the earlier Final Fantasy games. At the time, this was Sakaguchi's favorite Final Fantasy game, as it was the closest to his ideal Final Fantasy game. And that's high praise coming from the creator of Final Fantasy. And who am I to disagree? Designs for the game were inspired by the Dark Crystal. The team wanted to focus on depth of characters and relatability, even adding active time events that allowed players to experience other characters separate from Zidane, the main protagonist. Strong influence from the franchise can easily be seen in the character designs, looking like the platonic ideal of the job they represent. Zidane looks like a thief, with an added tail for effect. Steiner, Vivi, Garnet, all designed to look exactly as their class would. Also, can I just say how much I love Vivi? He is one of the best characters in the entire series. Not to mention references to the crystals, cities, castles, and characters from previous games. Even one of the main antagonists, Garland, shares his name with the original Final Fantasy's main antagonist. Without going into all the details, references can be found from every single previous Final Fantasy if you know what you're looking for. Even the music is no exception to this, as there are plenty of allusions to previous games in the soundtrack. Speaking of which, Uematsu hit all the right notes with the soundtrack. See what I did there? Influenced by a blend of medieval and Renaissance music, he crafted several themes that were used to add emotional depth to the story, such as the main theme Melodies of Life, or my personal favorite, Not Alone. But he didn't just create one of the best soundtracks in the series, he also made reference to older themes from the franchise, such as the Volcano theme from Final Fantasy I, the Pandaemonium theme from Final Fantasy II, and even the Tantalus band playing Rufus's welcome ceremony from Final Fantasy VII, which honestly confused the heck out of me the first time I heard it. Like 7 and 8, the ATB battle system was back, and attributes that enhance the characters are learned through equipment. Only this time, there are skills on each piece of equipment that require AP that can be earned in battles a long experience to permanently learn the skill. A dream for grind-happy players like myself. Even better in the remaster since you can speed it up. But what made this game stand out more than any other are the characters. Right out of the gate, we're introduced to Zidane, Vivi, Garnet, and Steiner and kick off the adventure. Starting with Zidane, who is preparing for a performance in Alexandria with the Tantalus group, which is actually a front for their real mission, to kidnap Princess Garnet during her 16th birthday celebration. At the same time, we're introduced to Vivi and Puck the Rat, a black mage who makes his way through the crowded streets of Alexandria, trying to reach the castle to watch their performance. His innocence and curiosity about the world are immediately seen, creating this interesting contrast between him and the more seasoned personalities of Tantalus. Meanwhile, Princess Garnet, feeling trapped by her royal duties and the mysterious actions of her mother, Queen Braun, wants to escape the castle. She runs into Zidane during Tantalus's performance, and it's revealed that she actually wants to be kidnapped. Well, that was a shock. And then we see stuffy old Steiner, who goes off to try to address the princess being in danger. The way each of these characters are introduced and interact shows so much charm and character and humor. But what lays at the foundation for this entire adventure is that these four unlikely companions need to learn to work together to survive after the ship they all get into crashes into an evil forest. From there, you see that 9 balances some of the humorous elements, but the game is not afraid to lean into the darker, more tragic elements as it progresses. For such a light-hearted intro, the latter half of the game might surprise you. Again, I don't want to spoil anything here because I think this game is absolutely worth playing, and it just gets better and better. Man, and I remember playing this game for the first time. I grew up in this desert area in California, and there was one day where there was this freak storm. We were supposed to be heading into school, and it was a Wednesday, and my sister and I were hanging out at a nearby fast food restaurant. One of the kids from school ran in and told us that the school had been flooding and that a transformer was hit by lightning. But they were rounding people up on buses and sending the kids to nearby schools. Gotta get that state money, I guess. So my sister and I just went home. I remember going upstairs where my gaming setup was, popped in Final Fantasy IX, and in that rare and enjoyable rain, I didn't have any schoolwork to do, just several hours of Final Fantasy IX. And I fell in love with this game. And while I wouldn't appreciate it until much later, I loved the many illusions of this game. And the music. Oh my goodness, I have so much love for this soundtrack. I remember going into the overworld and just sitting there, letting the music wash over me. And I still do sometimes. Whenever that song comes on in my playlist for my music, it's just this hit of sweet nostalgia. Not to mention the famous Not Alone scene, which was so powerful and that song is so good. When I first played this game, I was entering into high school. I felt intimidated, kind of lonely, and as I played through and got to that Not Alone scene, the music is not only just good, but it plays this really interesting role in the story. The instrumentation of the song gave it this sort of battle theme vibe, even though much of the scene isn't a fight with any enemies. But that's just the thing. It is a battle, just one within the main character Zidane, and the characters fight for him in this scene, hence the title, Not Alone. Even though he felt lost and he tried pushing them away, they kept fighting for him until he finally comes to. And as a high schooler, I mean, even now. This scene hits so hard. This is such a great example of why I think this game was peak Final Fantasy. They just got so much right with scenes like this from a character, story, music perspective. As another example, Vivi in particular is an incredibly written character. He's an amnesiac, but as you see his story slowly unfold, how he handles it and carries forward is just so good. I actually had Vivi's theme on my MySpace page back in the day. No idea why everyone else had Blink-182 or Evanescence on their profile. Some people have no class. This is a game that feels like the Final Fantasy game. It tackled themes like existential suffering, acceptance of one's mortality, and the meaning that others can bring to your life in a way that was so satisfying and moving. It's probably one of the more mature Final Fantasies despite its appearance. And I'm very anxious to see what this rumored 9 remake will be like. I seriously doubt it'll be the insane scope of the 7 remake series, but I'm also not looking for that with 9. What I would love to see is a ground up take from a visual standpoint, as well as some much needed battle mechanic enhancements. And on that front, I mean, I wouldn't really mind the remake series battle mechanics, though I would in no way be upset if they just stuck to the ATB system with some modern enhancements and improvements. Or maybe a new take on ATB altogether. What I don't want is any change to the story or themes. There's a reason this is one of the highest rated games of all time. And even by today's standards, it's highly praised for its story and characters. So give me epic new visuals, battle enhancements, all day long, but I still want this to be a one-to-one remake from a story perspective. And don't you dare make this a mobile game, Square. Anyway, remake or no, this incredible game is available everywhere now. Switch, PS5, PC, Xbox, you name it. So if you haven't played this one yet, please do. This one is absolutely worth it and is one of the best representations of the franchise. And that's it for my ranking. But I'm not done quite yet. I know there are a ton of people who are new to the franchise and don't know where to start, so let me answer one of these frequently asked questions. No, it doesn't matter what order you play these games in unless there is a direct sequel like 10-2 or 13-2. And my recommendation for where to start is going to largely be based on what era you're interested in for the series. Many of these games are pretty different, resulting in a variety of experiences and a variety of opinions. If you're looking to hit one that gives you the best representation of the series, like I said, I'd say play Final Fantasy IX. As I've already explained, it is a celebration of the first 2 eras and it does it brilliantly. If you're looking to hit highlights from each era, I'd say 4, 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, and 16 are all fantastic places to start. And if you love them, you can, of course, fill in the gaps. And of course, if you want the MMO Final Fantasy Joyride and you're willing to put in the time, definitely check out 14. Or you could just play all of them and their sequels. And don't forget the spin-offs. Tactics in particular is absolutely incredible. Oh, and the Theater Rhythm series, once you've seen what I mean about those amazing soundtracks. And if you want to see this doofus talk more about Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy and some of his other favorites from 2023, the ones I gave him, check out this video. 2023, you don't even exist anymore. Get out of here.